The morning Eldon Marsh found the tin box. He had already been awake for 3 hours, which was nothing unusual, and he had already walked the west fence line in the dark, which was also nothing unusual, and he had already stood at the edge of the dry creek bed and listened to the sound of nothing, which was the sound the creek had been making since June, which was the sound that had been pulling him out of sleep every morning since his wife died and leaving him standing in fields that had nothing left to say to him. What was unusual was the root. The old apple tree at the southwest corner, the one his father had planted the year Eldon was born, the one that had stopped producing fruit 2 summers ago, and now stood in the early morning gray like something that had given up trying to explain itself. One of its surface roots had heaved up overnight. The freeze the night before had been the first real freeze of October, hard enough to lift things, hard enough to show what the earth had been holding. The tin was about the size of a cigar box, dark with age, dented on one corner, sealed around the lid with what had once been pine pitch, gone brittle now, and cracked open by the same cold that had lifted the root. Eldon stood over it for a long moment before he picked it up. He was not the kind of man who rushed at things. He had been a farmer for 40 years. Farming teaches a person that the ground gives up its secrets on its own schedule, not yours. He carried it to the kitchen table. He sat down. He was 58 years old, and he was living alone on 160 acres of Missouri bottomland that hadn't made real money in 3 years, and his son was coming home at the end of the week with papers in his briefcase, and the well had gone dry in September, and the nearest working water was Calla Vane's pump a quarter-mile east, which he had been borrowing from twice a week with a wagon and 2 empty milk cans, walking over and back without speaking more than 7 words to the woman, because that was how they had always conducted their neighborliness at a polite and functional distance for 20 years. He opened the tin. People said Eldon Marsh was finished. They had been saying it since Clara died, and they said it louder after the second failed harvest, and now that the well was dry and his son Taft was driving down from St. Louis with papers, they said it the way people say things they are no longer bothering to keep quiet. He didn't argue. He just kept getting up before dawn and walking his fence lines in the dark and standing at the edge of the dry creek bed. But what none of them knew, what Eldon himself did not yet know, was that underneath the driest corner of the driest farm in Riverbend County, Missouri, in the year 1931, something had been waiting for a very long time for exactly the right person to ask the right question. Before we go any further, if stories like this one mean something to you, take a moment right now and subscribe. Every week we bring you a new story, worth staying up a little late for, or settling in a little deeper. It costs you nothing. It helps us keep going. The kitchen in the Marsh farmhouse had not changed in the 31 years Eldon and Clara had lived in it together. The curtains were the same blue-checked cotton Clara had hung the spring after they were married, faded now to a pale suggestion of blue, the checks barely visible. The cast-iron skillet on the stove was the same one Clara's mother had given them as a wedding gift, so well seasoned by decades of use that it was essentially black all the way through. The table was pine-scarred with the history of every meal the family had ever eaten at it, every canning season, every school project Taft had spread across it on winter evenings. It was the kind of table that held time the way old wood holds warmth, slowly and longer than you'd expect. Eldon set the tin on that table and looked at it in the thin gray light coming through the east window. October light in Missouri. The kind that falls flat and pale across the land because the sun has given up the pretense of warmth and is now simply marking time until February. He worked the dried pitch loose with his thumbnail. It came away in flakes. The lid lifted with a sound like a small intake of breath, as if the box itself had been waiting. Inside, a folded piece of oilskin. Beneath it, something flat and stiff. He unwrapped the oilskin carefully, the way a person handles something that has survived longer than it had any reason to. The paper inside was yellowed at the edges, the fold lines gone soft with age, but the ink was still clear. Someone had used good ink. Someone had understood that what they were putting on this paper was meant to last. It was a map, not a map of roads or towns. A map of the land itself, the topography of the Riverbend area drawn by hand in careful, practiced lines. The creek was there. The ridge to the north was there. And across the whole of it, in a pattern that looked at first like decoration, but was not decoration, a series of small circles, each with a number beside it, each with a short notation written in a precise, unhurried hand. Eldon's farm was marked. The southwest corner exactly where the old apple tree stood. The notation beside it read, Good water 22 feet hard. Clay cap breaks at limestone shelf. He sat with that for a while. The light moved across the floor. A crow called once from the direction of the barn, then was quiet. The house made the small sounds old houses make in the early morning, the tick of contracting wood, the faint whistle of draft around a window frame that is settled out of true. Eldon looked at the bottom corner of the map, a name written small but clearly, H. Vane, Survey 1887. He set the map down on the table. He looked out the window at the field. He looked back at the map. Vane. There was only one family named Vane in Riverbend County, and had been for as long as anyone could remember. Calla Vane, who was 71 years old and had been a widow for 9 years, and who lived a quarter-mile east of this table in the house where she had lived since before Eldon had arrived in this county as a young man with a young wife and a second-hand plow, and the particular confidence of someone who has not yet been educated by weather. Eldon picked up his coat. He walked to Calla Vane's door for the first time in 20 years with anything other than milk cans in his hands. The Vane property sat slightly higher than the Marsh place on a long, gentle slope that caught the morning sun before it reached the bottomland. Calla's kitchen garden was put to bed for the winter, the beds neat and covered in straw. The fence posts she painted white every spring gone gray with the season, but still straight. She kept things straight. Eldon had always noticed that about her without ever having occasion to mention it. He knocked, the sound of someone moving inside, deliberate, unhurried. Then the door opened and Calla Vane stood in the frame with her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and a cup of coffee in her hand, and she looked at Eldon the way you look at the weather, with the attention of someone who has learned to read things that don't explain themselves. She looked at the map in his hand. Something crossed her face, not surprise, something quieter than surprise, something more like recognition arriving after a long wait. "Come in," she said. Calla's kitchen smelled of coffee and dried lavender and something else. Something older. A faint mineral quality like stone that has been near water. Eldon noticed it before he could explain it. He sat at her table, smaller than his pine also, but darker, older, and he laid the map out flat with both hands. She sat across from him. She put on her glasses. She looked at the map for a long time without speaking. Eldon had been a farmer for 40 years, which meant he had learned to sit with silence the way you sit with weather. You don't argue with it. You wait for it to tell you what it intends. Finally, Calla said, "Hezekiah drew this the summer of 1887, before you came to this county. Forgive Simon," her husband. Eldon had known the man slightly in the way that neighbors who work long hours know each other slightly. Hezekiah Vane had been a well digger by trade, had served the whole region for the better part of 30 years, had died of a stroke in 1922, 9 years ago. He was meticulous, Calla said. She did not say it with sentiment. She said it the way a person states a fact they are still relying on. Every survey he ever did, he kept a copy. He gave the original to the county office. He kept a copy at home. She paused. Except the ones he considered private. Private. Eldon looked at her. Why was this one private? She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. She looked at the map again. Because of what it showed, she said. And because of who owned the land it showed. She was quiet for a moment. Your father came to see Hezekiah in the spring of 1888. He had heard Hezekiah was doing surveys in the area. He asked about this land. Hezekiah told him what he had found. A pause. Your father asked him to keep the survey private, not to give it to the county. He said he wasn't ready to act on it yet, but he wanted to know it was there. He wanted to know the knowledge existed. Eldon sat very still. His father, Robert Marsh, had died in 1914. Eldon had been running the farm alone since then, except for the years Clara was alive, when running the farm alone felt less like solitude and more like partnership with the land. He had inherited the farm at 24 with 3 debts, a broken harrow, and the conviction that the land was good if you were patient with it. He had spent 34 years being patient with it. He had never known about the water. Why didn't he tell me? The question came out quieter than he had intended. Calla looked at him for a long moment. The morning light was full now, coming flat through her east window the same way it came through his. I don't know what he intended, she said. I know what Hezekiah told me, which is that your father said he would know when the time was right. He said the person who needed to find it would find it. Eldon thought about the root that had heaved up in the night, the freeze, the cracked pitch, the way the tin had opened with that small sound of held breath released. He thought about his father standing in this county in 1888, 43 years ago, talking to a well digger about water that was 22 feet under the southwest corner of the land his son would inherit. He thought about 3 years of drought, a dry well, a son driving down from the city with papers. He reached into the pocket of his coat and set something on the table between them. He had almost missed it in the tin. It had been beneath the map, smaller than the oilskin folded tight. He had opened it in the kitchen and not understood it and brought it anyway. A single piece of paper folded to the size of a playing card with 2 lines written on it in his father's hand. For the one who finds this. When the time is right, go to Calla. She will have what you need for the rest. Calla looked at the paper. She read it twice. Then she stood up from the table without speaking and went to the back room. Eldon waited. He could hear her moving, the sound of a drawer or a cabinet, the kind of deliberate searching that means a person knows what they are looking for and where it is but is taking the time to approach it properly. She came back with something in her hand. A plumb bob. Brass the size of a large thumb, worn smooth with use, the cord wound carefully around a small wooden spool. The metal had the deep, even color of something handled by working hands for decades, the kind of patina that couldn't be bought or manufactured, only earned. She set it on the table between them. Hezekiah used this for every well he ever dug, she said. He said a plumb bob doesn't lie. It doesn't know about straight lines or the theories of straight lines. It only knows where down is. She looked at it. He said that was the most important thing a person could know. Where down is. When everything else is shifting around you, if you can find where down is, you can find your way. She pushed it across the table toward Eldon. He looked at it. He did not pick it up yet. I can't take this, he said. You're not taking it, she said. I'm giving it. A pause. Hezekiah would have given it to you himself, but he died before you needed it. She looked at him with the direct, unhurried attention of a woman who had been watching a situation develop for 9 years and had decided her part in it was simply to be ready when the moment came. He always said the water under your land was the best in the county. He said whoever finally opened it up would be doing something worth doing. Eldon picked up the plumb bob. It was heavier than it looked. The cord was smooth and strong, the kind of cord that had been handled carefully and stored properly and would last another 40 years if it needed to. He held it by the spool and let it hang. The brass weight dropped and steadied. Perfectly still. Perfectly true. Water finds its own level, Calla said. She said it quietly, the way someone says a phrase that belongs to another person, a phrase that carries a voice inside it. Hezekiah used to say that. He said if you follow the water down, it will always find where it belongs. Eldon wrapped his hand around the brass weight and held it. He was 58 years old. His well was dry. His son was coming Friday with papers. He had 160 acres of Missouri bottomland that the county had been writing off in its assessments for the past 2 years. He had a neighbor he had borrowed water from twice a week for 3 months without once sitting at her table until this morning. And somewhere 22 feet below the southwest corner of his farm, beneath the roots of an apple tree his father had planted the year Eldon was born, there was water. Had always been water. He walked back across the field between the 2 properties, the long way through the edge of the sorghum field, where the stalks had been cut back in September and stood now in rows of dry stubble, casting long, thin shadows in the low morning light. He was not in a hurry. He was thinking about his father. Robert Marsh had been a quiet man. The way certain men are quiet not because they have nothing to say, but because they have already said the important things inside their own heads and have moved on. He had been a good farmer and a decent neighbor, and not much given to explanation. When he made a decision, he made it and moved forward, and if the decision turned out to be right, he did not revisit it, and if it turned out to be wrong, he did not revisit it either. He simply adjusted and moved forward again. The idea that Robert Marsh had known about the water, that he had stood on this land in 1888 and spoken to Hezekiah Vane about what lay beneath it, and had then gone home and made dinner and planted crops and raised his son and died in 1914, that he had done all of this with the knowledge of the water sitting in him like a stone in a pocket, patient waiting. Eldon thought about being a father. He thought about a son driving down from the city. He stopped in the middle of the stubble field and looked at the southwest corner of his property where the old apple tree stood against the pale October sky. He looked at it the way the map had taught him to look at it, not as a tree but as a marker. Not as a thing that had given up, but as a thing that had been standing over something for a very long time. He went to the barn. He got the long-handled spade and the post-hole digger and the pickaxe with the new handle he had fitted himself in August. He carried them to the southwest corner. He cleared the brush from around the base of the apple tree. He stepped off the distance from the tree that the map indicated. He put the plumb bob in his shirt pocket. He started to dig. The first 18 inches were topsoil black and friable good soil, the kind that gave under the spade like something that wanted to cooperate. Below that, the character of the earth changed. Heavier, denser, a reddish-brown clay that held itself in solid blocks when it came up on the spade, each block an inch of something that had been lying there undisturbed for longer than Eldon could easily imagine. He dug until the light began to thin in the west. He was 4 feet down. His back ached. His hands were blistered in 3 new places over the calluses. He climbed out of the hole and looked at the sky and then looked at the hole. 4 feet, 18 to go. He thought about his father. He thought about the patience it takes to know something and say nothing and simply wait for the right person to find it. He thought about Taft, who would be here in 3 days, who was 32 years old and carrying a debt that Eldon didn't fully know the size of, who had left Riverbend at 18 and built a life in the city, and who was driving down now because he had calculated with the logic of a man who lived by numbers that the farm could not survive. He covered the hole with boards so no animal would fall in during the night. He carried his tools back to the barn. He washed his hands at the pump. He went inside and made dinner, the same dinner he had been making on Tuesdays since Clara died, salt pork and beans and cornbread cooked in the black skillet that had been in this kitchen since before Taft was born. He sat at the table. He laid the map out flat again, smoothed the fold lines with the heel of his hand. He had looked at it 10 times already today, but now he looked at it differently. Now he was looking at all of it, not just his parcel in the southwest corner, not just the notation that read good water 22 feet. He was looking at the whole map, the whole survey. There were other marks, 7 of them, each with its own notation, each on a different parcel of land in the Riverbend area. Some with numbers similar to his 20 feet, 25, some deeper, some shallower, some with notations he didn't immediately understand. Seasonal, use spring only, one that read simply deep, good in drought, good in drought. He looked at that for a long time. He thought about the families he knew who still farmed this county. The Holts 1 field east, the Pruitt brothers to the north, old Delia Crane whose husband had died 2 years ago and who was running 60 acres alone. Half the families whose names appeared on parcels marked on this map were still here, still trying, still getting up before dawn and walking their fence lines and listening to the sound of dry creek beds. He folded the map carefully. He put it in the tin box. He set the plumb bob on top of it. He sat at the table for a while longer. He thought about a plumb bob that knows where down is no matter what is shifting around it. He thought about water finding its own level. He thought about knowledge buried under an apple tree for 43 years waiting. On Friday morning, Taft Marsh arrived at 7:15 earlier than expected, which meant he had driven through the night, which meant the papers in his briefcase were not a proposal so much as a conclusion he had already reached and was coming to deliver. He pulled the truck into the yard and got out and stood for a moment with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the farmhouse, the barn, the fields, the way a man looks at something he is trying to remember before he lets it go. Then he turned and saw his father. Eldon was at the kitchen table. The map was flat in front of him. The plumb bob was on the table beside it, the brass weight catching the morning light that came through the east window. Taft came inside. He set the briefcase on the floor near the door, not on the table. That was something. He sat down across from his father. He looked at the map. He looked at the plumb bob. He looked at his father's hands, which were blistered in new places over old calluses, which meant his father had been doing something physical with a tool, something he had not been told about. What is this? Eldon smoothed the edge of the map with his thumb. Something your grandfather left. Taft looked at it longer. He recognized the outline of the land, the creek, the ridge. He leaned forward and looked at the marks, the notations, the name in the corner. H. Vane, 1887. He looked up. Where did you find this under the apple tree? The old one at the southwest corner. Taft was quiet. He was doing the same thing Eldon had been doing since Monday, working through it, setting it against everything he thought he already knew about this place. "You've been digging," he said finally. 4 feet so far. By yourself?" "Yes." Taft sat back. He looked out the east window. The morning light came through, flat and pale October light, the kind that showed things plainly and without softening. "Bah," he said, and then stopped. He had not called his father that since he was a child. That particular word, softer than Dad, the word he had used when he was small, and the farm was not yet a problem to be solved, but simply the whole world. "What are you trying to do?" Eldon looked at his son. He looked at the map. He looked back at his son. "I'm trying to find what your grandfather already knew was here," he said. "And I'm asking you not to sign anything until I can show you." Taft looked at the papers in the briefcase by the door. He looked at his father. He looked at the plumb bob on the table, hanging still in the October morning air, the brass catching light, the cord going taut from the spool in one long, perfectly vertical line. He did not answer. But he did not pick up the briefcase either. He sat down across from his father at the pine table that had held every meal this family had ever shared. And outside the window, the driest farm in Riverbend County lay in the low morning light, and somewhere under the southwest corner, 22 feet below, the roots of an apple tree that had stopped producing fruit but had never stopped standing, something that had been waiting 43 years, continued to wait. Patient. As water is patient. As truth is patient. As fathers sometimes are when they love their sons well enough to believe they will come back on their own. Taft did not leave on Friday. He did not leave on Saturday either. He moved his bag from the truck to the small bedroom at the end of the hall, the one that had been his since childhood, the one with the window that faced the apple tree, and he did not say anything about the briefcase which stayed by the front door where he had set it, and Eldon did not say anything about it either. Some negotiations are conducted entirely in silence, some of the most important ones. Saturday morning, Eldon was at the hole by first light. Taft came out an hour later with 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to his father without speaking, stood at the edge of the hole and looked down. 4 feet of Missouri clay, the walls dark and straight, a clean rectangle cut into the earth. He looked at it the way an engineer looks at something, measuring, calculating, finding the problems before they announce themselves. He went back inside and came out with the post hole digger. He did not ask permission. He just climbed down into the hole. They worked until noon without much conversation. Taft had his father's hands wide across the knuckles, built for grip, and he knew how to use a tool. Eldon had made sure of that before the boy left for the city, whatever else the city had taught him afterward. They got another 18 inches down before the clay changed character. Harder now, less cooperative. The spade bounced off it like the earth had made a decision. Eldon climbed out and crouched at the rim and looked at the wall his son was working. "Try the pick," he said. Taft tried the pick. It made a sound like striking iron. "What is that hardpan?" Eldon had seen it before in the old days when they had put in fence posts on the north field, a layer of clay so compressed by centuries of weight above it that it had turned nearly into stone. "It's not rock. It'll break." It did not break easily. Taft worked at it for 40 minutes before the first crack opened. Then another. Then the hardpan came apart in plates, each one the color of dried brick, each one requiring the pick swung hard and square to loosen. By the time they got through it, they were at 7 feet, and Taft's arms were shaking with the effort. He climbed out and sat on the edge of the hole with his legs hanging over and his hands on his knees, and his breath coming hard. Eldon looked at the walls of the dig. The hardpan layer was maybe 8 inches thick. Below it the clay was different again, darker, heavier, something in it that caught the thin October light and held it. He said nothing about this to Taft, not yet. Some things needed to be seen at the right moment to mean what they meant. They ate lunch at the kitchen table. Canned tomatoes and cornbread, the same lunch Eldon had been eating since September when the garden gave out. Taft ate without complaint, which was something. The boy had grown up eating whatever the farm produced, and the body remembered what the mind sometimes forgot. Taft looked at the map, which was still on the table, weighted at its corners with a salt cellar, a coffee cup, and the plumb bob. 22 feet, he said. "We're at 7. "Yes." "That's 15 more feet of that. Not all of it hardpan." Taft looked at his father. "How do you know? The map says the water sits on a limestone shelf." "Limestone doesn't look like what we just came through." Taft was quiet. He picked up the plumb bob and held it by the spool the way Eldon had shown him, let the brass weight drop and hang. He watched it find its stillness. What did Calla say about it? She said her husband called it the best water in the county. Taft set the plumb bob down. People say a lot of things about land they want someone else to believe in. Eldon looked at his son. He understood what was underneath the words, not meanness, not cynicism, only the self-protection of a man who had been careful with hope for a long time, and was not yet ready to stop being careful. He did not argue with it. You did not argue a man out of careful. You showed him something real and let him do the arithmetic himself. Let's get back to it, Eldon said. The second week went slower. The clay below the hardpan was wet-packed, dense, heavy, coming up in thick slabs that weighed more than they looked. The post-hole digger was useless in it. They were working entirely with the spade and the pick, now trading off every half hour, the one below digging, while the one above hauled the bucket up on the rope they had rigged from the barn pulley. Amos Holt appeared on Tuesday morning. He came across the field from the east, moving with the deliberate, unhurried walk of a man who has decided something and is simply executing the decision. He was carrying his own spade across one shoulder. He stopped at the rim of the hole, looked down at Taft, looked across at Eldon. He did not introduce himself or explain himself. He just said, "Where do you want me?" Eldon looked at him. Amos was 42 broad-shouldered. His left hand gone at the wrist from a thresher accident 6 years ago, but what remained of that arm was still strong, and his right hand was the strongest hand Eldon had ever seen on a working man. They had been neighbors for 12 years. They had the relationship that farmers have, the kind built from mutual recognition of what it costs to keep land alive, conducted mostly in nods and practical favors, and the occasional hour of shared fence mending. Eldon said, "Hauling if you're willing. The rope work." Amos nodded. He set down his spade, picked up the haul rope, and went to work without another word. He came back Wednesday. He brought his oldest boy, 16, who could haul even better than his father, and asked no questions at all, only worked. On Thursday, a man named Cuttrell from the Pruitt operation showed up, said he had a few hours, and spent 4 of them at the haul rope without being asked to stay longer than he had offered. Nobody explained why they were there. Nobody made a speech about it. They simply came, did what was needed, and left. Eldon noticed, as he always noticed things without making more of them than they were. These were not men who were converted to anything. They were men who had been watching to see whether what Eldon was doing was real, and having decided that had made the quiet, practical decision to be part of something real. That was how this valley had always worked underneath the noise of its opinions. The noise was loud, and it was often unkind, but beneath it something older and more durable than opinion ran through the people who had stayed on this land through hard years. Something that recognized effort and answered it, not with speeches, with rope work. By the end of the second week, they were at 14 feet. The wall of the hole had changed again. Here the earth gave way to something that wasn't clay and wasn't rock, a kind of gravel seam, pale gray, finer than road gravel, almost silty. Eldon ran it through his fingers at the bottom of the hole and felt the particular coolness of it, different from the coolness of the clay, above a coolness that had nothing to do with the air temperature. He climbed out. He said nothing. He stood at the rim and looked at the sky. That evening he walked to Calla's. She was on her porch with her mending, which she did every evening until the light failed. She looked up when Eldon came up the path, and she read whatever was on his face, because she said before he had spoken, "You found the gravel seam." He stopped. "How did you know?" Stopped. "How did you—" "Because Hezekiah always said you'd know when you were close. He said the gravel goes cold before the water shows itself." She set down her mending. "He called it the earth's announcement. He said the earth doesn't hide water from people who are paying attention. It announces it. You just have to know the language." Eldon sat on the step below her chair. He turned the plumb bob over in his hands. "How much further?" Hezekiah's notes said the limestone shelf on your parcel was between 18 and 22 feet. "You're at 14. She looked at him steadily. "You're not going to stop now?" "No." "Then go home and sleep. You'll need your back tomorrow more than you need to sit here worrying at it." He looked up at her. There was something he had been meaning to ask since Monday and hadn't. "Calla, when Hezekiah did the survey, when he found all those points." He paused. "Did he ever think about opening them up himself? Sharing what he knew with the county?" She was quiet for a moment. The light was almost gone now. The fields around them were the deep blue-gray of October dusk, the kind of color that makes distances impossible to judge. He wanted to, she said. He talked about it more than once. He drew up the map for that reason. A pause. But nobody asked. And Hezekiah was not the kind of man to push a gift on people who hadn't requested it. She picked up her mending again, though the light was now too poor to see the stitches. He said if people wanted to know what was under their land, they'd ask. He said you can't give someone knowledge they haven't decided to receive. Eldon thought about that on the walk home. He thought about his father who had asked. He thought about the families whose names appeared on the other marks on the map, who had never asked, who, perhaps, had never known there was a question. He thought about what asking was, really. Not just the words, the willingness underneath them. He went home. He slept. On the morning of the 17th day, Eldon was at the bottom of the hole at 18 feet when the pick struck something that rang. Not the dull sound of clay. Not the flat crack of hardpan. A clear, resonant tone, the kind of sound a thing makes when it is solid and true and has been waiting to be found. He crouched in the 4-foot circle of the hole and pressed his palm flat against the floor. Limestone. Gray-white, close-grained, the surface of it worn smooth by whatever had moved across it over a very long time. He pulled the plumb bob from his pocket. He held it by the spool and let the brass weight hang in the narrow space. It steadied, perfectly still, perfectly true. He looked at the limestone beneath his feet. He pressed the toe of his boot against it, feeling for the variation in sound that Calla had described from Hezekiah's notes, the hollow note that meant the shelf was thin here, that meant there was something underneath that was not solid. He moved 2 feet to the left. He tapped with the pick handle. Solid. He moved another foot. He tapped again. The sound changed. A half step lower. A fraction less density. He crouched and pressed his ear to the stone the way Hezekiah's notes had instructed, and he listened. And in the deep quiet of 18 feet underground, with the October sky, a pale circle above him, and the smell of limestone and cold gravel around him, he heard something. Not water, not yet. A potential. The sound of a thing poised. He came up out of the hole and walked across the field to Calla's without stopping for his coat. She was already in her garden putting in the last of the garlic bulbs before the ground froze. She looked up when she heard him coming. She read his face again the same way she had read it the other evening, with the same quiet accuracy. She stood up from the bed and brushed the soil from her hands. "Tomorrow," she said before he had spoken. "Take it slow at the shelf. Use the hand chisel, not the pick. You want the shelf to open, not shatter." Hezekiah said shattering the shelf risks silting the water. Slow, clean work. Let it find the crack naturally. Eldon nodded. He was breathing harder than the walk should have caused. She reached into the pocket of her work apron and handed him something. A folded paper. His notes on the limestone shelf work. "I copied them out last week in case." He took the paper. He looked at it. Then he looked at her. "You knew I was going to get here." "I thought you might," she said. There was something in the way she said it, not pride exactly, not satisfaction, something more like the quiet completion of a long wait. "I hoped you would." He folded the paper carefully and put it in his pocket next to the plumb bob. "Thank you, Calla." She waved him off and went back to her garlic bed. He was halfway across the field when she called after him. "Eldon." He stopped, turned. She was still crouching over the garden bed, not looking at him, pressing bulbs into the soil with the careful, deliberate attention of a person doing work that mattered. Hezekiah would be glad, she said. "That's all." He carried that across the field with him. The next morning, Taft brought the hand chisel from the barn without being asked, which meant he had read Hezekiah's notes over Eldon's shoulder the night before. They worked the limestone shelf together slowly the way Calla had described. Small, careful strikes. Following the natural grain of the stone, reading it the way his father had taught him to read the grain of an oak log 20 years ago, though neither of them said that. The crack appeared on the third morning. A hairline running northeast from the point where Eldon had heard the change in tone. He worked it with the chisel tip, patient, unhurried, widening the line by fractions. Taft crouched beside him with the lamp. The light was very close and very yellow in the narrow space, and they were both breathing the same mineral air, and the crack was widening. Then the water came, not all at once, not dramatically. First a darkening along the crack line, a deep wet gray spreading through the limestone. Then a seeping. Then as the crack widened by one more careful stroke of the chisel, a running. Clear. Cold. Rising slowly from the limestone fissure with the quiet, unhurried confidence of something that had always known it was there. Taft went very still. He did not say anything. He put his hand into the rising water and held it there. And after a moment he looked at his father, and his face was the face of a man who has just had a calculation overturned by evidence, and does not yet know what to do with the new arithmetic, but knows that the old arithmetic no longer applies. Eldon looked at the water. He thought about his father. He thought about 1888. He thought about 43 years of patience, of knowing and waiting, of trusting that the person who needed to find it would find it. He reached into his shirt pocket. He took out the plumb bob. He held it by the spool and let the brass weight drop into the rising water. It hung perfectly still, the tip submerged the line running true. Water finds its own level, Eldon said. He said it quietly to no one in particular, or perhaps to Hezekiah Vane, or perhaps to his father. Taft heard it. He looked at his father. He looked at the plumb bob. He did not say anything. But when they climbed out of the hole that afternoon, Taft did not go back inside. He stood at the rim and looked down at the slow, clean rise of water at the bottom, and his jaw was set in a way Eldon recognized. Not the set of a man preparing to refuse, but the set of a man preparing to make a different kind of decision than the one he had driven down from the city to make. That was the evening Eldon found his father's letter. It had been in the tin all along. He had seen it without seeing it that first morning, too focused on the map, too busy with what was immediately useful. It was at the very bottom, beneath the oilskin folded smaller than the map, the paper thinner. His father's handwriting smaller and more careful than the notation on the note he had found earlier, the handwriting of a man taking time over what he was saying. He read it at the kitchen table while Taft was washing up. Eldon, if you found this, the time was right, and I was wrong to doubt it would come. I've known about the water since '88. Hezekiah Vane showed me what was under the corner where your grandmother's tree stands, and I made a decision I want to explain to you now. I didn't tell you because I knew you. I know that sounds backwards, so let me say it straight. I watched you grow up on this land. I watched the way you worked it, not for what you could get out of it, but for what you could give back. Most men who know there's water under their land start thinking about what it's worth. You would have started thinking about what it could do. I wanted you to come to it that way. Not as an inheritance, as a discovery. The water is there. Everything Hezekiah mapped is real. But the water under your corner isn't the only water he found. There are 7 other points in this valley marked on the survey he gave me to keep. Some of those families are going to need what's on that map before you do. I hope you'll share it. I hope I raised you too. Eldon set the letter down on the table. He sat there for a while. Outside, the October dark had come down fully over the fields. Somewhere out in it, under 160 acres of Missouri bottomland water, was rising in a limestone fissure at 22 feet, filling slowly, patient and clear and cold. He thought about 7 other marks on the map. He thought about the Holtz 1 field east, about Delia Crane on her 60 acres alone, about the Pruitt operation to the north, which was down to 1 brother now and running on borrowed time, the same as everyone else. He thought about what it would mean to walk to each of those properties with this map in his hand. He thought about what it would have meant to him 3 weeks ago, before he found the tin, before he knocked on Calla's door, before he understood what the apple tree had been standing over all his life. He folded the letter. He put it back in the tin on top of the map. He sat at the table and listened to his son moving around in the back of the house. The ordinary sounds of someone settling in for the evening boots, set down water running, the creak of the floorboard outside the bathroom door that had creaked for 20 years and that Eldon had always meant to fix and hadn't. He needed to tell Taft about the letter. Not yet, but soon, when the right moment came. He did not know yet that the right moment was not going to be his to choose. 3 days later, Eldon walked into the Riverbend Savings and Loan to pay the October note on the farm's operating line, which he had been paying for 11 years, without missing a payment, which he considered a point of personal principle that existed entirely apart from anything else that was happening, or had happened, or might happen. Orville Deeke was standing at the counter. This was not unusual. Deeke had an office in the building. He was at the counter often. What was unusual was the way he looked at Eldon when Eldon came through the door, not with the mild practiced courtesy that Deeke applied to everyone. The courtesy of a man who understood that money worked better with a pleasant face on it, but with something else. Something more specific. The look of a man who has already been thinking about you and has been waiting for you to arrive. Eldon, he said. Orville. Deeke moved down the counter away from the teller, lowering his voice to the register that meant what he was about to say was between the two of them. I hear things are progressing on your property. Eldon looked at him. He said nothing. He had learned long ago that Orville Deeke was most comfortable filling silences, and that the easiest way to find out what a man like Deeke actually wanted was to give him enough silence to fill. Groundwater, Deeke said. Interesting development. Valuable potentially depending on what you plan to do with it. A pause. Have you given any thought to what you plan to do with it? Some. Because as you know, the situation for a number of farms in this area is precarious, and water rights once established can be a significant asset. A leverageable asset. He let that sit. If a man were inclined to think about his options. Eldon paid his note. He thanked the teller. He walked out. He drove home. Taft's truck was in the yard, but Taft was not in the house. Eldon went through to the back and stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the field toward the well site where he expected to see his son. Taft was not at the well site. He was at the far end of the property near the road, standing with his hands in his pockets, talking to a man in a good coat who was nodding at something Taft was saying with the patient, practiced attention of a man who has come to listen before he proposes. The man in the good coat was Orville Deeke. Eldon stood at the window. He understood. Deeke had not been at the savings and loan by accident. Deeke had been there because he knew Eldon would come to pay his note the way Eldon always paid his note, because Eldon was predictable in the ways that honest men are predictable. And Deeke had spent 30 years in this county, learning the predictable patterns of honest men, and using those patterns the way a trapper uses a trail. The conversation at the counter had been a distraction, a way to read Eldon's face, to confirm what he was already planning. And what he was already planning was standing at the far edge of the property talking to Eldon's son, nodding at whatever terms he was offering whatever he needed to offer. Taft had debts in the city. Deeke would know the size of those debts. Deeke knew the size of everyone's debts. That was how Deeke worked. He collected obligations the way a farmer collected seed, patiently one at a time until the harvest came. Eldon watched for another moment. Then he walked away from the window. He went to the table. He opened the tin box. He took out the map. He took out his father's letter. He sat down. He sat there in the kitchen of the house where he had lived for 31 years with the late afternoon light coming flat and pale through the window, and he held his father's letter in his two hands, and he did not go outside, and he did not raise his voice, and he did not go to the end of the property and interrupt whatever was happening there. Because if he went, one of two things would happen. Either Taft would stop talking to Deeke because his father had come to make him, which meant nothing, which would solve nothing, which would only delay what was building between his son and a man who had more patience than either of them, or Taft would not stop. And Eldon was not yet sure which of those things was more likely. He had raised his son to think for himself. He was about to find out what his son thought. Outside, the light was failing. The well site at the southwest corner was a dark rectangle against the pale stubble field, and from it, if you looked carefully, you could just see the darker wet of the water that had risen overnight to within 4 feet of the surface, rising still slow and clear and certain the way water always found its level when something had finally opened a way for it to go. The map lay flat on the table. 7 other marks. 7 other families. And somewhere at the end of the road, his son standing in the cold with a man who had already calculated the price of everything Eldon had spent 3 weeks building. The kitchen was very quiet. Eldon pressed his palm flat on the table. He waited. Taft came in at dark. He came in the way a man comes in when he has been outside longer than he intended, not with explanation, not with apology, just with the particular quiet of someone who has been doing something he is not yet ready to talk about. He hung his coat on the peg by the door. He went to the stove and poured himself coffee from the pot Eldon had kept warm. He stood with his back to his father for a moment, both hands around the cup. Eldon was at the table. The map was in front of him. The letter was in front of him. The plumb bob was on the table beside them, the brass weight resting on the pine, the cord loose. He had not moved in 2 hours. Taft turned around. He looked at the table. He looked at his father's face, and whatever he saw there made him pull out the chair across from Eldon and sit down without speaking. The lamp between them cast a yellow circle on the table. Outside, the wind had come up from the northwest, the kind of wind that meant the temperature was going to drop before morning. The house settled around them with its familiar sounds. Eldon slid the letter across the table. Taft looked at it. He looked at his father. Then he picked it up and read it. He read it slowly. Eldon watched his son's face move through what was in the words, not dramatically, not with any visible collapse, but with the particular careful attention of a man taking in something that is reorganizing things he thought were settled. When Taft finished, he set the letter down. He looked at the plum bob on the table. He said, "He came to find me." Eldon said, "I know." Deeke. He knew I had debts in the city. He knew the number. Not an approximation. The number. Taft's jaw tightened. He offered to buy out the debt in full if I signed authority over the water rights before the well was completed. He said once the well was legally producing, the price of the rights would be higher than he was willing to pay. "What did you say?" Taft was quiet for a moment. "I said I needed to think." Eldon nodded. He had expected this. This was the honest answer. He would have been more worried about a son who had said no immediately, because the immediate no would have been reflex, and reflex was not the same as decision. "How much?" Eldon said. "The debt." "Yes," Taft told him. The number was larger than Eldon had imagined and smaller than he had feared, which was the particular shape that most honest disasters took when you finally looked at them plainly. He sat with it. "All right," Eldon said. Taft looked at him. "All right, what?" "All right, that's the number. Now we know the number." He put his hand flat on the table. "We're not signing anything over to Orville Deeke." "But we're not," Eldon said. He said it the way his father had said things, not loudly, not with heat, but with the finality of a decision already made and not available for renegotiation. "I don't say that because I don't understand what you owe. I say it because what's under this land doesn't belong to Orville Deeke, and I am not going to be the man who hands it to him. Your grandfather wasn't. I'm not going to be." He paused. "And I don't think you are either, or you wouldn't have said you needed to think." Taft looked at the letter again. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said very quietly, "He sounds like you." Eldon did not answer. The way he wrote, the way he explains himself. Taft set the letter down. His voice had changed. Something in it had gone quieter and more honest, the way a voice goes when a person stops performing the part they came in to perform. "I didn't know him the way you did. I was 9 when he died. I remember his hands. I remember he smelled like cut wood." A pause. "I didn't know he thought about me. I didn't know." "He thought about you before you were born," Eldon said. "He thought about whoever was going to come after. That's what the map is. That's what the whole thing is." Taft put his hand over his eyes. Not crying, not yet, but close to the country that bordered it. The country a man approaches and skirts along the edge of when he is 32 years old, and he has been carrying something heavier than he told anyone, and someone has finally seen the weight of it without making him put it down in public. Eldon waited. After a while, Taft took his hand down. He looked at the ceiling. He breathed once deliberate, the breath of a man finding his footing. "What do we do about the debt?" Eldon looked at the map. He had been looking at it for 2 hours. He had been thinking about 7 marks and 7 families, and a father who had hoped his son would share what he found. "I have an idea," he said, "but I need you to drive me somewhere in the morning." Taft looked at him. "Where?" Eldon put his finger on the map on the Mark 1 property east of his own, the notation that read, "Good water, 18 feet, gravel seam consistent." "Amos Holt's land," he said. They drove to the Holt place before breakfast. Amos was already in his barn when they pulled into the yard, which was not surprising because Amos Holt was always already in his barn. He came out when he heard the truck and stood in the barn door with the particular neutral watchfulness of a man who has learned to read arrivals before committing to a response. Eldon got out. He had the map in his hand. He walked up to Amos and he held out the map and he said, "I need you to look at something, and then I need to tell you something, and then I need to ask you something. And I want you to know that the asking is real. I'm not going to tell you what to answer." Amos looked at him for a moment. Then he took the map. He studied it for a long time, standing in the cold yard with the map held flat in both hands, the November wind coming off the north field and moving the papers slightly at the edges. He found his parcel. He found the notation. He read it. He looked at the point marked on the survey, and then he looked up and looked across his own field, toward the eastern edge where the land dipped slightly toward the creek, and something passed across his face, a recognition or the beginning of one. Your father surveyed this, Eldon said. Hezekiah, 1887. He found the same kind of water under your east corner that was under my southwest corner. 18 feet. He said, consistent. A pause. I found water last week. It's rising. It's going to be a producing well before the ground freezes. Amos looked at him. I want to dig your well next, Eldon said. I want to dig it, and I want you and me to own the rights to it together. Not charity. A shared agreement, terms we work out between us based on what each of us contributes and what each of us needs. Because what I need is someone with more knowledge of this land than I have, and what you need is water, Amos said. Yes. Amos looked at the map again. He looked at the 7 marks beyond Eldon's parcel. He understood immediately what he was looking at because Amos Holt was not a man who needed things explained twice. He looked up. Who else knows about this Calla? Taft. Eldon paused. Deeke may be guessing. He doesn't have the survey. Amos was quiet for a long moment. The cold had put color into his face, and his breath was visible between them, slow and even. A man doing arithmetic, but not the kind with numbers. My grandfather, he said finally, used to say that the difference between a good neighbor and a bad one was simple. A good neighbor knows what you need before you ask. A bad one waits to see if your need becomes an opportunity. He folded the map carefully along its original lines. He held it out to Eldon. You could have kept this to yourself. Eldon took the map. Yes. You're not going to. No. Amos looked across his field. He looked at the barn behind him, at the house where Lena was moving behind the kitchen window, at the frozen yard where his 3 children had played that morning before school. When do we start? He said. They started the following Monday. Word moved through the valley the way word always moved, not through announcement, but through the particular underground current of small community knowledge, the thing that passed between people at the grain elevator and the post office and the church steps without ever being formally communicated. By Tuesday, 2 more men had shown up at the Holt property with tools. By Thursday, there were 5. Nobody said Orville Deeke's name out loud. Nobody needed to. Deeke came to the Marsh property on Wednesday afternoon. He came alone, which was not how he usually conducted his business, and he came to the front door rather than catching Eldon in the field or at the bank, which meant he had decided this required the register of formality. Eldon opened the door. Deeke stood on the porch with his hat in his hands, a gesture of courtesy so practiced it had become simply a mechanism. He said he had heard about the Holt project. He said he thought perhaps there had been a misunderstanding at the savings and loan. He said he was open to a conversation about shared interests. Eldon looked at him for a moment. Then he said, Orville, I'm going to tell you what I told my father. I would tell you even though he died before he could ask me to tell you, and I didn't know I was going to have to until this week. Deeke waited. Whatever's under this land isn't for sale. Not the rights, not the access, not the leverage. Eldon kept his voice even. He was not angry. Anger would have been a kind of gift to Deeke, something Deeke could work with, negotiate around. What Eldon was offering was simpler and less negotiable than anger. You've bought a lot in this county over the last 10 years. I understand how that works. But what we're doing with this water is different, and I think on some level you know that, or you wouldn't have come to the front door. Deeke looked at him for a moment. His face moved through something and then settled back into its usual arrangement. He was a man who had learned early that the face was a tool, and he kept his tools maintained. You're a stubborn man, Eldon Marsh, he said. I know it. Deeke put his hat on. I hope you know what you're doing. I think my father did, Eldon said. I'm just following the map. Deeke walked back to his car. Eldon watched him go. He stood on the porch until the car reached the road and turned south toward town. Then he went back inside. Taft was at the kitchen table. He had heard all of it through the door which Eldon had left open 2 inches for precisely that reason. Taft said he'll find another way. Maybe Eldon said. But not this way. And this way was the way that mattered. He sat down across from his son. He picked up the plumb bob from the table. He held it by the spool and let the weight drop and hang between them. "Your grandfather wrote that the people who needed the map would find it," Eldon said. "I think he meant something more than just me. I think he meant that the right person would know what to do with it when the time came." He watched the brass weight settle into stillness. "I'm not sure the time has fully come yet, but I think it's coming." Taft looked at the plumb bob. He watched it hang perfectly vertical, perfectly still. "Bah," he said. "Teach me how to dig a well." It was the first week of December when they held the meeting. Not a formal meeting, not announced through any official channel. Calla had simply gone to each family on the map, all 7 parcels, and knocked on their doors and told them there was something they needed to see. She had done this over the course of 3 days, moving from farm to farm in her old truck with the map copy Eldon had made for her, and she had told each family the same thing in slightly different words adjusted for what she knew about each of them, because she had known most of them for 40 years and knew how to say a thing so that particular person could receive it. They came to the Marsh farmhouse on a Saturday morning. 14 people, farmers' wives, one elderly brother from the Pruitt operation who had driven himself in a truck that sounded like it was making its last trip. Delia Crane, who had driven her 30-year-old wagon because the truck needed a part she hadn't been able to afford. Amos and Lena Holt, whose well was now at 12 feet and through the hardpan. The Cuttrell man who had done rope work for 2 weeks without being asked and had never explained why. They stood in the kitchen and the front room and spilled back into the hallway, and they smelled of coal and wood smoke and the particular mineral quality of people who had been working land through a hard season. Eldon spread the map on the kitchen table. He stood at the head of it and looked at the people in his house, and he understood for the first time the full weight of what his father had buried under the apple tree. It was not just water. It was not just a survey. It was this particular gathering, these 14 people, the Holt children who had come with their parents and were now sitting on the kitchen floor looking at the ceiling this cold December morning with the frost still on the windows and the smell of the coffee Calla had arrived early to make. He said, "My father knew about this map for 43 years. He kept it because he believed the right person would know what to do with it. I don't know if I'm the right person, but I know what I want to do." He put his finger on each of the 7 marks on the map, one by one. "Every one of these parcels has water under it. Good water. Consistent water, most of them. Hezekiah Vane surveyed this valley in 1887, and he found something that this county has been sitting on without knowing it for 44 years. He looked up. I want to share this. Not as a business, not as something anyone owns, as something that belongs to the people whose land it's under, which is already true, whether we dig for it or not." The room was quiet. Not the uncomfortable quiet of people who don't know how to respond. The quiet of people who are taking in something that is changing the shape of what they thought they understood about their situation. Delia Crane spoke first. She was 73, had been farming 60 acres alone for 2 years, and she had the voice of a woman who had stopped wasting it on things that didn't matter. "What do you need from us?" "Labor," Eldon said. "Shared. The same way Amos and I worked it. Everyone works everyone's well. Everyone contributes what they can. Everyone ends up with water." He paused. "And everyone agrees that the rights stay with the land. Not for sale. Not to Orville Deeke. Not to anyone." Amos said. "And the debt situation for some of us." Eldon looked at Taft. Taft was leaning against the wall near the hallway, his arms folded, listening. When his father looked at him, he unfolded his arms. He pushed off the wall. He came to the table and stood beside his father and looked at the map. He said, "There's water on 4 of these parcels that's deep enough and consistent enough to be worth more than whatever Deeke has offered any of you. If you can hold 2 more seasons, the value of what's under your land changes the conversation with the bank." He looked around the room with the direct practical attention of a man who had spent 10 years in the city learning exactly the kind of arithmetic that was useful in exactly this situation. "I can help with that. With the numbers. The legal side of the water rights. Making sure what belongs to your land stays with your land." Eldon looked at his son. Taft did not look back at him. He was already talking to Delia Crane about the specifics of her note. He had the tone of a man who had found the work he was actually supposed to be doing, the work that fit the shape of what he knew, the work that connected what he had learned in the city to the land his grandfather had understood from underneath. The meeting lasted 3 hours. When it ended, people did not leave quickly. They stood in the yard in the December cold and talked to each other, the specific practical talk of people who have arrived at a shared project and are beginning to map out its logistics. Who had what equipment? Which wells to start first based on the season? How to organize the labor across the farms. Calla stood beside Eldon on the porch and watched them. She said Hezekiah would have done this himself if anyone had asked. Eldon said, "I know." He waited 40 years for someone to ask. "I know that too." She was quiet for a moment. "My son," she said, and then stopped. She did not continue right away. The cold was sharp, and the light was the low, flat light of early December, cutting across the yard at an angle that made everything cast a long shadow. He left in 1922, the same year Hezekiah died. I haven't heard from him in 9 years. Eldon looked at her. "I used to think he left because of Hezekiah," she said. "Because Hezekiah was a hard man to be the son of. Exacting. Didn't say things in the easy way." She watched Taft in the yard talking to Amos with a piece of paper in his hand, making notes. "I don't think that anymore." A pause. "I think he just wasn't ready yet. I think some people need longer to find their way back to what they came from." She said it without grief. Without the performance of grief, at least. What was underneath it was older and quieter than grief, the sustained daily work of a woman who has made peace with something she cannot change, but has not stopped hoping about. Eldon did not say anything for a while. Then he said, "If he ever does, Calla, if you ever hear from him, there's room." She looked at him. Her face did not change, but something in her eyes did. Something that had been held at a careful distance moved slightly closer. "Thank you, Eldon," she said. She said it the way she said everything, plain, without ornamentation, meaning precisely what the words contained. "That's enough. That's more than enough." The first snow came the following week. It came on a Wednesday light and early, the first snow of the season that stayed. It covered the fields and the bare orchards and the cut stubble of the sorghum, and it covered the wooden casing of the marsh well, which now had a hand pump fitted and standing clear at the surface, and it covered the fresh-turned earth of the Holt dig site where they were at 15 feet, and through the hardpan and into the gravel seam. Eldon walked the fence lines that morning in the snow. He walked the west line and the north line and came around to the southwest corner where the apple tree stood. The tree was white now, the bare branches holding the snow in small, perfect accumulations on each horizontal surface, the way snow found every level place and rested there. He stood under it and looked up through the branches at the white sky above. He thought about his father planting this tree the year Eldon was born. He thought about what his father must have known, standing at this corner in 1888, with Hezekiah Vane's words still fresh, looking at the sapling he had planted over ground that held something he had decided to wait on. The patience that required. Not the passive patience of someone without options, but the active patience of someone who had chosen to trust the land, to trust time, to trust the son who would come after him. He reached into his coat pocket. He took out the plumb bob. He held it by the spool and let the brass weight drop. The cord ran straight and true in the cold, still air. The brass weight hung without movement, without hurry, pointed as it always pointed, directly, precisely, inevitably down. Toward the water. Toward the limestone shelf 22 feet below where the fissure ran northeast, and the water had been rising since October, clear and cold and patient, the way things are patient when they know they have nowhere else to go and no reason to hurry. He heard footsteps behind him. Taft came through the snow from the direction of the barn carrying 2 cups of coffee the way he had carried them that first Saturday morning, without announcement, without ceremony. He stopped beside his father. He handed him one of the cups. He stood looking at the apple tree. He did not look at the plumb bob immediately. He looked at the tree for a while, the way you look at something you are learning to see differently than you saw it before. Then he looked at the plumb bob. He watched it hang. He said, "I called the city yesterday, told them I'm staying." Eldon wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. The warmth came through his gloves. The firm, Taft said. "I'll keep a few clients here, help with the water rights work. The rest I'm done with." He paused. I know there are things to figure out. The debt is still there. I'm not pretending. I know. But I want to figure them out here." He looked at the tree again. I want to figure them out on this land." The snow was falling again lightly, the small, precise flakes of a cold that wasn't hurrying. It fell on the branches of the apple tree, and on the wooden casing of the well, and on the two men standing in the southwest corner of the Marsh property, and it fell without sound, the way snow falls when the air is still enough to let it. Eldon looked at his son's profile, the jaw his son had from him, the eyes that were his mother's. He thought about his father who had planted a tree and buried a map and written a letter and died without knowing how any of it would end, trusting that it would end right because he had chosen the right person to trust. He thought about Hezekiah Vane, who had surveyed a valley and drawn 7 circles and known that water and knowledge were the same kind of thing. They didn't disappear when you covered them over. They waited. They found the cracks. They rose. He thought about Calla on her porch in the October evening saying Hezekiah would be glad, saying it without sentiment, with the plain, matter-of-fact quality of a woman stating what she knew to be true. He thought about 14 people in his kitchen on a December morning looking at a map. He thought about a plumb bob that doesn't know about theories of straight lines, only where down is. He reached over and put his hand on his son's shoulder. He held it there for a moment, the way his father had probably wanted to hold it on 100 occasions and perhaps had and perhaps hadn't, the particular gesture that means I see you and I'm here, and I was right about you, and your grandfather was right about you, and the land was right about all of us without requiring any of those things to be said aloud. Taft put his hand over his father's for a moment. Then they stood together in the snow under the apple tree, drinking their coffee, watching the snow come down on the Marsh property, on the well casing, on the fields, where next spring something was going to be different, because a man had found a tin box under a root and asked his neighbor the right question. The plumb bob hung between them, turning very slowly in a draft so slight it was nearly nothing, finding its stillness, finding it the way it always found it, the way water finds its level, the way truth finds its way up, the way a son finds his way back to his father's land when the time is right and the ground is ready to receive him.